Welcome to Emotions Unfolded. Here, every story begins with heartbreak, but not every ending belongs to those who caused it. If you love emotional family dramas, shocking betrayals, hidden truths, and unforgettable justice, you're in the right place. Subscribe and turn on notifications because today's story will stay with you long after it ends. I was only 15 when my parents stopped the car in the middle of a violent storm and told me to get out. They believed my sister's lie without asking me a single question. I watched our taillights disappear into the rain, convinced I was going to die alone. But that night, someone found me, someone who changed my life forever. 10 years later, the same parents who abandoned me stood frozen outside a crowded charity gala. The moment they saw who was standing beside me, my father collapsed into tears, because the child they had thrown away had become the one person they never expected to see again. This is my story. My name is Naomi Carter, and for years I believed that parents would always protect their children. I was wrong. When I was 15 years old, I learned that love inside a family could disappear in a single sentence, especially when someone else controlled the story. Looking back now, I realized that storm had started long before the rain ever fell. Our family looked perfect from the outside. My father, Richard Carter, owned a successful construction company. My mother, Helen, volunteered at every school fundraiser and smiled for every neighborhood photo. We lived in a beautiful two-story house where every holiday looked like something from a magazine. People envied us. They had no idea that inside those walls there was only one child who truly mattered. My younger sister, Emily, was everyone's little angel. She had bright blue eyes, a sweet smile, and an incredible talent for pretending to be innocent. Teachers adored her. Neighbors praised her. My parents believed every single word that came out of her mouth. Me, I was simply the difficult daughter. If Emily forgot to finish her homework, somehow it became my fault for distracting her. If she broke something expensive, my parents assumed I had scared her. If she cried, I was automatically guilty before anyone even asked what had happened. At first, I tried defending myself. Eventually, I stopped, because the verdict never changed. Dad always repeated the same sentence. Emily would never lie. Those 4 words slowly destroyed every piece of confidence I had. The worst part wasn't being punished. It was realizing that my parents never even looked at me while making their decisions. Their minds were already made up. I spent most evenings hiding in my room, reading library books and dreaming about turning 18. Freedom became my favorite fantasy. The only person who ever treated me like I mattered was my grandmother, Margaret. She lived 30 minutes away and visited whenever she could. Every time she noticed another punishment or another unfair accusation, she'd quietly pull me aside. "Don't let them convince you you're the problem, sweetheart," she'd whisper. Sometimes adults choose the easiest lie instead of the hardest truth. I didn't fully understand her words back then. Years later, they would echo in my mind every single day. Everything finally exploded on a cold Friday in October. Rain clouds covered the sky before lunchtime. By evening, the weather forecast warned everyone to stay off the roads because a severe thunderstorm was approaching. Mom insisted we still drive to my aunt's house for dinner. Halfway there, Emily suddenly screamed from the back seat. "My bracelet!" Mom looked over. "What bracelet?" "The diamond bracelet Grandma gave me." She immediately burst into tears. "It's gone. Naomi stole it." The car fell silent. I turned around so fast my neck hurt. "What?" "You've been jealous ever since Grandma gave it to me," Emily sobbed dramatically. "You took it this afternoon." "I didn't even touch your room." Dad slammed the steering wheel. "Enough." I felt my heartbeat racing. "Dad, she's lying." Emily cried even harder. "I saw Naomi put it in her backpack before school." My mother spun around in her seat. "Open your backpack." "I didn't take anything." "Open it." My hands shook as I reached for my school bag. I already knew what was coming. Emily had become too confident lately. She wouldn't accuse me unless she believed she couldn't lose. Dad dumped every notebook onto the passenger seat. Pens, homework, a library novel, my lunch container. Then a small velvet jewelry box rolled onto the floor. Mom gasped. Dad froze. Emily buried her face in her hands, pretending to cry even harder. I told you. I stared at the box. My entire body went numb. I've never seen that before. Dad slowly opened it. Inside was Grandma's diamond bracelet. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment, not frustration. Something colder. Disgust. I raised a thief. No! I shouted. Emily, put it there. Emily immediately screamed through fake tears. Why would I frame my own sister? I looked desperately at Mom. Please, you know me. Instead of answering, she quietly looked away. That hurt more than anything. Dad restarted the engine without another word. The storm outside grew worse. Rain hammered against the windshield so hard we could barely see the road. 10 minutes later, instead of turning toward home, Dad pulled onto a lonely stretch of highway surrounded by dark woods. He unlocked the passenger door. Get out. I laughed nervously. Dad, stop joking. I'm not joking. My stomach dropped. You can walk home. It's storming. You should have thought about that before stealing from your own family. I didn't do it. His voice exploded. Get out. Mom never looked at me. Emily hid a tiny smile behind her tears, believing no one could see it. I stepped out into the freezing rain. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I turned back toward the car one last time, praying one of them would stop this nightmare. No one did. The passenger door slammed shut. The engine roared. Red taillights disappeared into the darkness. And within seconds, I was completely alone in the middle of the storm. I had no idea that before sunrise, a stranger would save my life, and everything my family believed was about to change forever. The rain soaked through my clothes within seconds. Cold water dripped into my eyes as thunder cracked so loudly it felt like the sky was splitting apart. Every passing minute made the empty highway seem even darker. Cars rushed by, their headlights briefly lighting the road before disappearing again. I waved desperately at every vehicle. None of them stopped. I hugged myself tightly, trying to stay warm, but my hands had already gone numb. My sneakers were filled with water, and every step felt heavier than the last. I kept asking myself the same question. How could my own parents leave me here? Not after a fight. Not after running away. They had abandoned me because they believed a lie. I had walked for nearly 20 minutes when dizziness hit me. I hadn't eaten much that day, and the freezing rain was draining every bit of strength I had left. My knees buckled. I stumbled onto the gravel shoulder of the road. For a moment, I honestly believed this was how my story would end. Then, bright headlights slowed behind me. A pickup truck stopped a few yards away. The driver's door opened. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out, holding a flashlight. He didn't rush toward me. He stayed several feet away, careful not to frighten me. Kid, are you all right? I tried to answer. Nothing came out. The man quickly removed his heavy rain jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders. Easy, he said gently. You're freezing. His voice carried something I hadn't heard all day. Kindness. My name's Daniel Brooks. What's yours? N. Naomi. Where are your parents? I looked toward the empty highway. They left. His expression changed immediately. They left you? I nodded. He didn't ask another question. Instead, he opened the passenger door. Come on. I'm taking you somewhere warm. For reasons I still can't explain, I trusted him. Maybe because he never demanded answers. Maybe because he looked more worried than suspicious. Or maybe because, after being rejected by my own family, simple kindness felt impossible to ignore. Daniel drove me to a small farmhouse about 15 minutes away. The lights inside glowed warmly against the storm. As soon as we entered, a woman hurried toward us. Oh, my goodness! She looked at my soaked clothes. What happened? Daniel quietly replied, I'll explain later. This girl needs help first. His wife, Grace Brooks, immediately wrapped me in blankets and led me toward the fireplace. She brought hot chocolate, dry clothes, warm soup. Not once did either of them ask whether I deserved to be there. Not once did they accuse me of lying. Grace smiled gently. "You're safe now." Those 4 words broke something inside me. I hadn't cried when my parents drove away. I hadn't cried while walking through the storm. But sitting beside that fireplace, I completely fell apart. I cried until I couldn't breathe. Grace simply held my hand. Daniel sat quietly across the room, giving me all the time I needed. Hours later, after I finally calmed down, Daniel asked softly, "Can you tell us what happened?" I told them everything. About Emily, the bracelet, the accusations, years of never being believed, and finally being abandoned on the highway. Neither of them interrupted. When I finished, silence filled the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I've been a police officer for 32 years. I've seen children lie. I've seen parents lie. And I've learned something. The truth usually survives." I looked at him. "You believe me?" He answered without hesitation. "Yes." It was the first time anyone in my family had ever said those words. The next morning, Daniel drove me to the local police station. Not because I was in trouble, because he intended to report child abandonment. The officer behind the front desk listened carefully before making several phone calls. Within an hour, Child Protective Services had been notified. Meanwhile, across town, my parents were beginning to realize something wasn't going according to plan. Emily was eating breakfast when the house phone rang. Dad answered. His face changed instantly. "What do you mean she's at the police station?" Mom nearly dropped her coffee. Emily stopped chewing. The officer explained that a passing driver had found a 15-year-old girl abandoned during the storm. Dad insisted there had been a misunderstanding. "We only wanted her to think about what she'd done." The officer's voice turned cold. "Sir, leaving a minor alone during severe weather is not discipline. It's child abandonment." Dad's face lost all color. For the first time since leaving me on that highway, fear replaced anger. As my parents rushed toward the station, Emily quietly slipped upstairs. She entered her bedroom, closed the door, opened her closet, then smiled. Hidden inside an old shoebox was another velvet jewelry case. Inside it sat Grandma Margaret's real diamond bracelet. The one Dad had supposedly found in my backpack had been a cheap fake Emily had secretly ordered online weeks earlier. She looked at the real bracelet and whispered to herself, "They'll never figure it out." But downstairs, someone else had already noticed something she didn't expect. Grandma Margaret had just arrived at the house, and before Emily could hide the evidence again, Grandma saw the genuine bracelet sparkling inside the open shoebox. Everything was about to change. Grandma Margaret froze in the doorway. For a brief second, neither she nor Emily spoke. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded impossibly loud. Emily's eyes widened. Then she slammed the closet door. But it was too late. Grandma had already seen it. "What was that?" she asked calmly. "And nothing." I said, "What was that?" Emily forced a nervous laugh. "You scared me, Grandma." Margaret slowly walked toward the closet. Emily stepped in front of it. "You don't need to look in there." Grandma looked directly into her granddaughter's eyes. "Move." Something in her voice made Emily hesitate. For years, everyone in the family had ignored Margaret whenever she defended Naomi. Today was different. Emily slowly stepped aside. Margaret opened the closet. She reached for the old shoebox. Inside rested the real diamond bracelet, not the fake one Richard had found in Naomi's backpack. The genuine bracelet Margaret herself had purchased years earlier. She recognized a tiny scratch near the clasp that no copy could ever duplicate. Margaret closed the lid. Her heart sank. She had suspected Emily was lying many times before. Now she had proof. Without saying another word, she picked up the box and walked downstairs. Richard and Helen were grabbing their car keys. "We're going to the police station," Richard said. Margaret held up the jewelry box. "No, you'll explain this first." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" She opened the box. Helen gasped. The bracelet Margaret nodded. The real one. Richard looked confused. That's impossible. I found it in Naomi's backpack. No, Margaret replied. You found a fake. Silence filled the kitchen. Emily slowly walked downstairs. Her face turned pale. Margaret looked at her. Would you like to explain? Emily immediately started crying. I don't know how it got there. Richard looked uncertain for the first time. Margaret wasn't finished. She walked to the dining room cabinet and returned with several old family photographs. One picture clearly showed Margaret wearing the bracelet years earlier. The unique scratch near the clasp was visible. She placed the photograph beside the bracelet. They match. Helen covered her mouth. Richard stared at Emily. Tell me the truth. Emily shook her head violently. I didn't do anything. Margaret calmly pulled something else from the box. A folded receipt. She unfolded it. It wasn't for the real bracelet. It was for an online purchase. A costume jewelry company. One fake diamond bracelet. Purchased 3 weeks earlier. Richard grabbed the receipt. His hands trembled. Emily tried to snatch it away. It's not what it looks like. Margaret's voice became firm. No, it's exactly what it looks like. At the same moment, I sat inside a quiet office at Child Protective Services. Daniel Brooks sat beside me. Across the desk, a caseworker named Lisa Monroe reviewed the police report. She looked up gently. Naomi, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you something. Has anything like this happened before? I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe last night had been a terrible mistake. Instead, memories flooded my mind. Every false accusation, every punishment, every birthday where Emily opened more gifts because she deserved them. Every time my parents ignored me. Every night, I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough. I slowly nodded. Lisa sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Daniel quietly added, She's been emotionally neglected for years. Lisa closed the file. We won't be sending her home today. For the first time in my life, someone was protecting me. An hour later, Richard and Helen arrived at the station. They looked exhausted. Dad's confident posture had disappeared. Mom's eyes were red from crying. The officer escorted them into the interview room. Daniel stayed beside me. Richard looked at me. Naomi. I didn't answer. He took one hesitant step forward. I'm sorry. Those words should have meant everything. Instead, they felt strangely empty, because apologies couldn't erase the image of their taillights, disappearing into the storm. Lisa interrupted. Mr. Carter, before we discuss reunification, I understand new evidence has surfaced. Richard slowly nodded. He placed the fake bracelet, the receipt, and a photo of the real bracelet on the table. His voice cracked. Emily lied. Helen burst into tears. Richard couldn't even look at me. I believed the wrong child. I waited. Part of me expected him to ask me to come home. Instead, he whispered something that hurt even more. I don't know how to fix this. Neither did I. As everyone sat in heavy silence, Daniel received a phone call. He listened for several seconds before hanging up. What is it? Lisa asked. Daniel looked at me, then at my parents. The weather team searched the highway this morning. Richard frowned. Why? Daniel answered quietly. They found fresh skid marks and evidence that a semi-truck lost control in the exact spot where Naomi was abandoned. The truck had crashed into the roadside barrier less than 15 minutes after my parents drove away. If I had stayed where they left me, I would have been standing exactly where the truck crashed. The room fell completely silent. Richard stared at the accident photos. His knees suddenly gave out. He collapsed into the chair, covering his face with both hands. For the first time in my life, I watched my father cry, not because he'd lost money, not because he'd been embarrassed, but because he had finally realized his decision had nearly cost his daughter her life. The room remained silent long after my father broke down. No one knew what to say. The accident photos were still spread across the table, each one showing the mangled highway barrier only a few hundred feet from where I had been abandoned. Dad couldn't stop staring at them. His shoulders shook as tears streamed down his face. I almost killed my own daughter. His voice was barely a whisper. Mom reached for his hand, but he pulled away. No, he said hoarsely. Don't. We both failed her. For the first time in my life, they weren't arguing about who was right. They were forced to face what they had done. Lisa Monroe finally broke the silence. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, this investigation isn't over. Until we complete our assessment, Naomi will remain under temporary protective care. Dad nodded without protesting. A week earlier, he would have demanded that I come home immediately. Now, he understood something had changed. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with a simple apology. Because there were no immediate relatives approved to take custody, Child Protective Services asked if I would be willing to stay with Daniel and Grace Brooks for a few days while the investigation continued. Lisa smiled gently. It's completely your choice. I looked at Daniel and Grace. Neither of them pressured me. Grace simply said, if you stay with us, you'll have your own room. Daniel added with a small smile, and I make pretty good pancakes. For the first time in days, I laughed. It was only a tiny laugh, but it reminded me that I was still capable of feeling something besides fear. I'd like to stay with them, I said quietly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed my hand. We'd be honored. The Brooks farmhouse quickly became something I'd never experienced before. Peace. Every morning, Grace knocked before entering my room. Every evening, Daniel asked about my day. If I made a mistake, they explained it instead of yelling. If I had a nightmare, Grace sat beside my bed until I fell asleep again. One evening, while helping Daniel repair an old wooden fence, I accidentally dropped an entire box of nails into the mud. I froze. Back home, that would have ended with shouting. Instead, Daniel chuckled. Looks like we'll be picking these up together. You're not angry? He looked genuinely confused. Why would I be? It was an accident. I stood there speechless. At 15 years old, I was just beginning to understand what normal kindness looked like. Meanwhile, things inside the Carter house were falling apart. Emily's lie had finally unraveled. Grandma Margaret handed the fake bracelet receipt to the investigators. Police searched Emily's laptop. Within hours, they found the online order confirmation for the fake bracelet, along with deleted messages showing she had planned everything weeks in advance. When confronted, Emily tried denying it, then blaming me, then blaming stress. Finally, she admitted the truth. I just wanted Mom and Dad to love me more. Richard stared at her in disbelief. We already gave you everything. Emily looked down. I was afraid Naomi would take Grandma away from me. Margaret sighed sadly. You didn't lose my love because of Naomi. You lost my trust because of your choices. Helen covered her face and cried harder than anyone had ever seen. For years, she had ignored every warning Margaret gave her. Now she understood the price of never questioning the child who always seemed perfect. Several weeks passed. School became easier than I expected. Word spread quietly that I had been found during the storm, but Daniel and Grace protected my privacy. They never let reporters or curious neighbors ask me uncomfortable questions. To everyone else, I was simply staying with family friends. That simple lie gave me something priceless, a chance to heal. One afternoon, Lisa Monroe visited the farmhouse carrying a thick folder. Daniel invited her inside. She smiled warmly. I have some updates. She explained that the court had ordered parenting evaluations for my parents and mandatory counseling for Emily. But then she looked directly at Daniel and Grace. I also need to ask you something. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What is it? If Naomi can't safely return home, would you consider becoming her long-term guardians? The room fell completely silent. Grace immediately looked at me, not because she expected an answer, because she wanted to know how I felt. Daniel cleared his throat. We'd need to think about it. Then he smiled. For about 5 seconds. Grace laughed through tears. We already have. If Naomi wants us, she's family. I couldn't speak. No one had ever chosen me before. Not without conditions. Not because they had to. Simply because they wanted me. Tears blurred my vision. "I'd like that," I whispered. Grace wrapped me in the warmest hug I'd ever known. For the first time since that storm, I truly felt safe. Across town, Richard received a call from his attorney. The investigation into child abandonment was nearly complete. The attorney's voice was serious. "Richard, the judge has reviewed everything. The evidence, the witness statements, the accident reports, the fake bracelet, the psychological evaluations." Richard swallowed hard. "What's going to happen?" There was a long pause. Then the attorney said the words Richard feared most. "The court believes Naomi's best interests may be served by remaining with the Brooks family." Richard slowly lowered the phone. He looked around the house. Family photos covered every wall. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. In almost every one, Emily stood in the center. Naomi stood at the edge. Or wasn't there at all. Only then did Richard notice something that had been true for years. His oldest daughter had been disappearing from their family long before the night they abandoned her on the highway, and he had never noticed. That realization hurt more than any punishment the court could ever give him. The courtroom was packed the day the judge made the final decision. I sat between Daniel and Grace Brooks, my hands trembling so badly that Grace quietly reached over and squeezed them. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered. "No matter what happens, you're not alone." Those words gave me more strength than she probably realized. Across the room sat my parents. Richard looked years older than he had only a few months before. His once confident posture had disappeared, replaced by a man weighed down by regret. Helen barely looked up from the floor. Emily wasn't there. She had been ordered into long-term counseling and chose not to attend. Judge Eleanor Hayes reviewed every report in silence. The evidence was overwhelming. Child abandonment, years of emotional neglect, false accusations, the deliberate framing involving the fake bracelet, character statements from teachers, neighbors, Grandma Margaret, Child Protective Services, and Officer Daniel Brooks. Finally, the judge removed her glasses. "Naomi Carter." My heart pounded. "You have experienced repeated emotional harm in your parents' home." She glanced toward Richard and Helen. "The court recognizes your remorse. However, remorse cannot erase years of neglect." The courtroom became completely silent. Judge Hayes looked back at me. "Effective immediately, temporary guardianship will become permanent until adulthood. You will remain in the care of Daniel and Grace Brooks." I closed my eyes, not because I was sad, because for the first time in my life, I finally had a home. Outside the courthouse, Richard approached Daniel. I know I don't deserve to ask this, but please, take care of her." Daniel looked him straight in the eyes. I already do." Richard nodded. "I know." He turned toward me. "I'm sorry, Naomi. I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I'd listened to you." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I quietly replied, "I hope one day you become the father you should have been." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth. The years that followed changed everything. Daniel officially adopted me shortly after my 18th birthday. I chose to keep the last name Brooks, not because I wanted to erase my past, but because I wanted my future to reflect the people who had truly loved me. Grace helped me apply for college. Daniel taught me how to drive. Grandma Margaret visited every Sunday with homemade apple pie and endless hugs. She often smiled and said, "Families aren't built by blood alone." I finally understood what she meant. I studied social work in college. Later, I earned a graduate degree in child advocacy. Every child who felt invisible reminded me of the frightened 15-year-old girl standing alone in the rain. I promised myself no child under my care would ever wonder if they mattered. Years later, I founded the Safe Tomorrow Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided emergency housing, counseling, and scholarships for abandoned and abused teenagers. It started with one small shelter, then another. Within a decade, we had centers across 3 states. Thousands of children found safety because someone had once stopped for me during a storm. 10 years passed. The frightened girl disappeared. In her place stood a confident woman addressing hundreds of donors at our annual charity gala. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Reporters lined the walls. Business leaders, judges, community volunteers, and former foster children filled every table. Daniel and Grace sat proudly in the front row. Grandma Margaret smiled through happy tears. As I stepped onto the stage, the audience rose in applause. I looked around the room. This foundation exists because one stranger refused to drive past a child who needed help. I turned toward Daniel. My father saved my life. Daniel's eyes immediately filled with tears. He wasn't my biological father, but everyone in that room knew exactly who I meant. The audience applauded again. Then, near the ballroom entrance, I noticed 3 familiar faces: Richard, Helen, and Emily. They stood frozen, unsure whether they even belonged there. Grandma Margaret had quietly invited them without telling me. Richard looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely gray. Helen clutched a small gift bag with shaking hands. Emily looked nothing like the confident girl who had manipulated everyone years earlier. She couldn't even meet my eyes. One of the event volunteers walked toward them. "Can I help you?" Richard swallowed hard. "We're here to see Naomi." The volunteer smiled warmly. "You're just in time. She's about to receive the National Child Advocacy Award." Richard looked toward the stage. His eyes found mine. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then the giant screen behind me displayed childhood photographs. One image showed 15-year-old Naomi standing in oversized borrowed clothes beside Daniel and Grace the morning after the storm. Another showed my college graduation. Another showed children laughing inside one of our shelters. The final photograph appeared. It was a recent family portrait. Daniel, Grace, Grandma Margaret, and me. Underneath it were 6 simple words. Family is who stays. Richard's knees suddenly weakened. Tears streamed down his face. He covered his mouth, unable to stop crying. The little girl he had abandoned in a storm had grown into a woman who was saving thousands of children, and he realized he had missed every single moment that mattered. The ballroom remained silent as my father stood near the entrance, tears running down his face. For years I had imagined this moment. I imagined him apologizing. I imagined him regretting everything. I imagined him finally understanding the pain he caused. But standing there, looking at the man who once left me alone in a storm, I realized something important. The 15-year-old girl who needed his approval was gone. She had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, someone who no longer needed anyone else to tell her she mattered. I stepped down from the stage slowly. The entire room watched. Daniel and Grace stood behind me, ready to support me if I needed them. When I reached my father, he struggled to speak. "Naomi." His voice cracked. I don't even know where to start. I looked at him quietly. "Start with the truth." He lowered his head. "The truth is, I failed you." The words hung between us. I was supposed to protect you. I was supposed to believe you. But I trusted a lie because it was easier than admitting I had ignored you for years. His hands trembled. I lost my daughter because I wasn't brave enough to see the truth. For the first time, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. Not guilt because people were watching. Not embarrassment because the world knew. Pain. Real pain. But forgiveness is complicated. Some wounds close. Others leave scars that remind you what happened. "I waited years to hear you say that," I whispered. Richard nodded. "I know. And I know an apology doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase that night. It doesn't erase all the other nights when you made me feel invisible." Tears rolled down his cheeks. "I know. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked past him, at Daniel and Grace, at the people who showed up when my own family walked away. Then I looked back at Richard. "I forgive you." His eyes widened. "But," I continued, "forgiving you doesn't mean pretending it never happened. It means I won't carry your mistake as my burden anymore. My father covered his face and cried, not the quiet tears of regret, the painful tears of someone finally understanding what they had lost. Then Emily stepped forward. For a moment, the entire room became tense. She looked completely different from the girl I remembered. The confidence was gone. The manipulation was gone. Only regret remained. Naomi. I looked at her. I owe you the biggest apology. She swallowed. I spent years telling myself I only wanted attention. But the truth is, I was jealous. I saw how Grandma loved you. I saw how people respected you. And instead of becoming better, I tried to destroy you. Her voice shook. I was 15 too. But I made choices. Terrible choices. She wiped her tears. I don't expect you to forgive me. And I don't deserve to be part of your life. The room stayed silent. I remembered the fake bracelet, the lies, the night in the storm, the feeling of watching my family choose someone else's story over mine. But I also remembered something Daniel once told me. Holding on to anger gives the person who hurt you control over your future. I took a slow breath. Emily. She looked up. I forgive you too. Her face changed instantly. But forgiveness doesn't mean we're going back to being sisters like nothing happened. She nodded. I understand. Trust has to be earned. A small tear fell down her cheek. I'll spend the rest of my life trying. After the speeches ended, I walked back to the stage. The award was still waiting. I held it in my hands and looked at the crowd. This award isn't just mine. It's for every child who has ever felt unwanted. Every teenager who wondered if anyone would notice when they disappeared. I was that child. But one person stopped. One person opened a door. One person showed me that family isn't only about who shares your blood. It's about who chooses you when life gets difficult. Everyone looked toward Daniel. He stood up, overwhelmed with emotion. The applause that followed filled the entire ballroom. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stood outside beneath the quiet sky. No storm, no darkness, just peace. Daniel walked beside me. You okay? I smiled. Yeah. He looked toward the stars. 10 years ago, I only stopped because I saw someone who needed help. I never imagined that little girl would change the world. I laughed softly. I never imagined that stranger would become my father. He smiled. I think we both got lucky. I looked back at the ballroom. Inside were photographs from my life. The life I built, not the life I was given. And finally I understood something. My parents left me on the side of the road thinking they were taking away my future. They had no idea that night was actually the beginning of it. The storm that was supposed to break me introduced me to the people who would rebuild me, and the family I lost led me to the family I was always meant to find. The end.